Nobody tells you that awakening is not what you imagined it would be. You probably expected clarity, a settled sense of peace, the feeling of finally arriving somewhere after years of searching. What Jung found, after decades of studying people who had undergone genuine psychological transformation, was something far stranger and far less comfortable than that. He found that awakening does not feel like peace, not at first. It feels like disorientation, like the ground you have been standing on your entire life has quietly shifted beneath your feet without announcing itself. Like the person you thought you were has become slightly transparent, and something larger and less familiar is beginning to show through. And the experiences that come with it are not the ones the spiritual marketplace sells you. They are not bliss states or visions or a sudden freedom from suffering. They are specific, identifiable, psychological phenomena that Jung spent his career documenting with the same rigor he applied to everything else. Observable, repeatable, and almost impossible to explain to anyone who has not been through them. That is the part nobody prepares you for, the isolation of it, the strange loneliness of having experiences that are real and undeniable to you, and that sound, to almost everyone around you, like the beginning of a breakdown. Jung was direct about this. He said the process of genuine individuation, his term for what we might call awakening, is not a journey toward ease. It is a journey toward wholeness. And wholeness includes everything, the light and the shadow, the known and the terrifyingly unknown, the self you constructed and the self that was always there underneath it, waiting. Today I want to walk you through 5 specific experiences Jung identified as markers of genuine spiritual awakening. Not the performed kind, not the aesthetic kind, the real kind. The kind that happens to you rather than the kind you curate. Because Jung believed there was an enormous difference between people who talked about awakening and people who were actually in the middle of it. And the difference, more often than not, showed up in exactly these 5 experiences. The first experience, the collapse of the story you have been telling about yourself. There is a narrative you have been carrying about who you are. It was built slowly, across years and decades, from the things people said to you, the things that happened to you, the conclusions you drew from those events, and the identity you assembled around all of it. This is the person you introduce at parties, the person your family knows, the person your inner monologue addresses as I. Jung called this the persona, and he was not dismissive of it. The persona serves a genuine function. It allows you to navigate the social world without exposing the full complexity of your inner life to people who are not equipped to receive it. But it is not you. It is a construction, a highly sophisticated, deeply habituated construction, and one of the earliest signs of genuine awakening, in Jung's observation, is the moment that construction begins to feel hollow. Not wrong exactly, not false in every detail, but hollow, like a coat that used to fit perfectly and has now become slightly too small in ways you cannot quite identify. You are still wearing it. You are still performing it. But there is a growing awareness underneath the performance that something in it does not belong to you, that you have been living inside a story that was partly inherited, partly improvised, and only partly true. This is not a comfortable experience. Most people, when it begins to happen, try to shore up the narrative rather than examine it. They double down on the identity. They become more certain, more fixed, more insistent about who they are and what they believe. Because the alternative, allowing the story to become genuinely questionable, feels like the beginning of falling apart. But Jung observed that the people who allowed the story to become questionable, who could sit with the disorientation of not knowing quite who they were for a period of time, were the ones who eventually came through into something more spacious and more genuinely their own. The persona does not have to be destroyed. It just has to stop being mistaken for the whole truth. You will know this experience has found you when you catch yourself mid-sentence in a familiar story about your life and feel, for just a moment, that you are not sure you believe it anymore. When the identity that used to feel solid starts to feel like something you are wearing rather than something you are. When the question of who you actually are, underneath all the accumulated narrative, starts to feel genuinely open rather than already answered. That openness is not emptiness. Jung was clear on this. It is the necessary precondition for something more real to emerge. The second experience, the eruption of what you have spent years not looking at. Jung called it the shadow. And it is perhaps the most misunderstood concept in all of his work, because people tend to assume the shadow means the dark parts of themselves, the anger, the selfishness, the pettiness, the qualities they are ashamed of, and those things are in there. But the shadow is not only that. The shadow is everything you have pushed outside the boundary of who you have decided you are. And that includes things that do not look dark at all. It includes the ambition you suppressed because it felt dangerous to want too much. The grief you set aside because there was never a good time to feel it. The creativity you abandoned because it seemed impractical. The parts of you that needed things you decided you were not allowed to need. The shadow is not evil. It is unintegrated. And it has been accumulating quietly for as long as you have been alive, growing heavier with everything you have looked away from, until the pressure becomes significant enough that it starts pushing through. In people who are genuinely awakening, Jung observed that this eruption becomes undeniable. Things they thought they had resolved start surfacing again. Emotions they believed they were done with return, often more forcefully than before. Patterns they thought they had outgrown appear in new relationships wearing new clothes. Dreams become vivid and strange and insistent in ways they have not been before. This is frequently the part of awakening that gets misdiagnosed. Because from the outside, and often from the inside, it looks like regression, like going backward, like the inner work is making things worse rather than better. But Jung was precise about this. The surfacing of shadow material is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that the psyche has finally determined that the person is ready to look at what has been there all along. The question the shadow asks is not what is wrong with you. It is what have you been unwilling to know about yourself. And the willingness to actually answer that question without flinching and without immediately trying to fix or resolve what surfaces is one of the defining features of genuine awakening as Jung understood it. You will know this experience when the things you thought you were over turn out to not be over, when the emotions you managed so successfully for so long start arriving uninvited, when the parts of yourself you learned to keep quiet start making noise, not because you are breaking down, but because you are finally strong enough to hear them. The third experience, a fundamental shift in how time feels. This one is harder to articulate, but Jung returned to it repeatedly in his writing. He noticed that people undergoing genuine individuation reported a profound change in their relationship to time. Not a mystical dissolution of time, but something more specific and more interesting than that. He observed that awakened individuals stopped living primarily in either the past or the future and began experiencing what he called the reality of the present moment, not as a spiritual concept, but as a felt, bodily truth. The past, which had previously occupied so much psychological bandwidth, its regrets and resentments and unresolved loops, began to lose some of its grip. Not because it was forgotten or bypassed, but because it had been genuinely metabolized, looked at, felt, understood, and therefore no longer needing to be continuously relitigated. And the future, which for most people is the primary residence of hope and anxiety alike, began to feel less like the real location of life, less like the place where things would finally be okay, where the work would be done, where the person they were meant to become would finally materialize. Awakened people, Jung observed, began to sense that they were already in the life they had been waiting to arrive at. that the present moment, in its full ordinariness, was not a waiting room but the actual thing. This shift does not make a person passive or detached from their future. It does not dissolve ambition or make planning feel pointless. What it does is change the emotional register of daily life. Things that used to carry enormous weight because of what they meant for some future version of events start to feel lighter. And things that used to seem too small to deserve attention, an ordinary conversation, the quality of light in the afternoon, a moment of unexpected beauty, start to feel like they contain something real. Jung connected this to what he called the experience of eternity in time. Not eternity as endless duration, but eternity as a quality of depth. The sense that a single moment, fully inhabited, contains more than a year of half-presence. That being genuinely here, without the mental noise of elsewhere, is not a spiritual achievement so much as a return to something that was always available and that you had simply been too busy to enter. You will recognize this experience not through a dramatic revelation, but through small moments of unexpected presence that arrive without you trying to produce them. A conversation that is suddenly, inexplicably, completely enough. A quiet morning that does not feel like time wasted. The discovery that you are, without quite knowing when it happened, less afraid of your own life. The fourth experience. The encounter with something larger than the personal self. Jung was a scientist, and he was careful with language. He did not use the word God casually or carelessly, but he spent his entire career documenting something that he believed was real, observable, and profoundly important, which was the encounter that awakening individuals invariably had with what he called the self, capitalized, to distinguish it from the everyday ego self. The self, in Jung's framework, is not a spiritual concept in the conventional sense. It is a psychological reality. It is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together. And it is experienced not as an abstract idea, but as a presence, something that feels both deeply intimate, more intimate than anything else, and at the same time larger than the individual, larger than the personal story, larger than the constructed identity, larger sometimes than what feels comfortable. People who encounter this in the context of awakening, and Jung documented hundreds of such encounters in his clinical work, describe it in remarkably similar ways across wildly different cultural and religious backgrounds. There is a quality of something that has always been there, but has only now become perceptible. There is a quality of recognition, not discovery, as if you are meeting something you knew before you had language for knowing. And there is frequently, alongside the profound sense of rightness, a quality of being seen, not judged, not evaluated. Seen, with a comprehensiveness and a patience that no human relationship quite manages. Jung believed this encounter was not a hallucination or a projection. He believed it was the psyche meeting its own deepest ground, and he observed that it changed people in ways that were both subtle and irreversible, not by making them more otherworldly or detached from ordinary life, but in many cases by making them more present in it, more willing to be here in this specific life with its specific limitations, because they had encountered something in themselves that was not limited in the same way. The encounter with the self does not resolve the difficulties of being human. It does not eliminate doubt or suffering or confusion. What it does, Jung observed, is provide a kind of orientation, a felt sense of what is real and what is constructed. A compass that does not always point toward comfortable, but that points, with a consistency that becomes trustworthy over time, toward something genuine. You will recognize this experience in the moments when something in you knows something that your thinking mind has not arrived at yet, in the quality of certainty that occasionally arrives about things that cannot be rationally justified, in the sense, which may visit briefly and without warning, that underneath everything that is complicated and unresolved, there is something in you that is completely, inexplicably, all right. The fifth experience, the recognition that your suffering has not been meaningless, This is the one Jung considered the most significant, and it is the one that is most easily misunderstood, because it sounds like it could be a form of spiritual bypassing, a way of reframing pain to make it more bearable, a story you tell yourself to avoid the full weight of what you have been through. But Jung meant something more rigorous and more demanding than that. He was not suggesting that suffering is good or that it always produces wisdom automatically. He had seen too much of it in his patients and in himself to be sentimental about it. What he observed in people who were genuinely awakening was something different. It was not that they had found a positive meaning for their suffering, it was that they had integrated it, made it part of the story rather than an interruption of the story, allowed it to be real without allowing it to be the whole truth. The difference matters. Meaning-making, in the shallow sense, tries to explain suffering away. It tries to reach a conclusion that makes the pain feel justified or purposeful or worthwhile. Integration does not do that. It does not require the suffering to have been worth it. It simply refuses to exile it, refuses to keep it behind a wall of avoidance or resentment or unfinished grief. It allows the wound to become part of the self rather than a foreign object the self has been organized around protecting. Jung observed that when this happened, something shifted in how the person moved through the world, not because they had resolved their pain, but because they had stopped fighting the fact of it. There was a kind of authority that came with having genuinely met what was most difficult in your own experience. A groundedness that could not be manufactured through positive thinking or spiritual practice because it came from something that had actually been lived rather than managed. He also noticed something else, that the qualities most worth having in a human being, the genuine compassion, the real patience, the kind of understanding that does not require the other person to explain themselves, were almost always forged in difficulty rather than in ease. Not because difficulty is necessary for growth, but because difficulty, when it is genuinely met rather than bypassed, tends to dissolve the illusions that prevent those qualities from emerging naturally. The spiritually awakened person, as Jung understood them, is not someone who has escaped suffering or transcended it or repackaged it into something more palatable. They are someone who has gone all the way through their suffering and come out the other side carrying it differently. Not lighter, necessarily, but differently, with a quality of presence around it that was not available before. You will recognize this experience when you realize, in a way that does not require anyone else to confirm it, that the hardest things you have been through have not diminished you. When the wounds that once felt like evidence of your inadequacy start to feel like evidence of your depth. When the story of your difficulty becomes not the most important thing about you, but something that is genuinely and undeniably yours. That shift, Jung believed, was not the end of awakening. There is no end to awakening, but it was one of its clearest signs, because a person who can hold their own suffering with that quality of integration is no longer organizing their life around avoiding pain, and a life that is not organized around avoiding pain is, almost by definition, a life that is free enough to move towards something real. These 5 experiences, the unraveling of the constructed self, the eruption of the shadow, the shift in the experience of time, the encounter with something larger than the personal, and the integration of suffering, do not announce themselves with certainty. They do not arrive with credentials. They often feel in the middle of them like the opposite of awakening, like confusion or regression or loss. Jung understood this. He said repeatedly that the process of individuation was not a linear ascent toward clarity. It was a spiral. You pass through the same territories again and again, but each time from a slightly different vantage point, with slightly more capacity to see what was there. The awakening was not in arriving somewhere. It was in the quality of attention you brought to where you already were. If you are having these experiences, the disorientation and the shadow material and the strange new relationship to time and the encounters with something that feels too large for language and the slow, difficult work of integrating what you have been through, you are not losing your mind, you are not regressing, you are not doing the work wrong, You are in the middle of what Jung called the most important journey a human being can undertake. Not the most comfortable, not the most linear, not the most explainable to the people in your life who have not yet begun it, but the most important. Because on the other side of it, what emerges is not a perfected version of the person you were trying to be. It is something more honest and more durable than that. A person who has genuinely met themselves, and who has found in that meeting that they were worth meeting all along.